Cathleen Houlihan 3 Hopes and Fears. In the first of these lectures, I offered you 10 theses on Cathleen Houlihan. In the second, I analysed 10 quotes from David Lloyd's Nationalisms Against the State. Here I'm going to offer 10 more theses about Yeats's essay Hopes and Fears and how it relates to his artistic project for Ireland. Thesis 11. Yeats's project in Hopes and Fears for Irish literature is predicated on cultivation of the Irish people to an artistic end. The essay is structured on the distinction between cultivated people and the best minds versus the prejudices of the multitude and the crowd. Yeats says that we must study all things Irish, and yet he seems to be conflicted in his relationship to things Irish. So this allows us to refine our first thesis. Yeats's project in Hopes and Fears for Irish literature is predicated on cultivation of the Irish people to an artistic end, but it also betrays disdain for the Irish people. Thesis 12. Hopes and Fears relies upon organic metaphors. Yeats asks whether the power that lies latent in the nation of Ireland is but the seed of some meagre shrub, or the seed from which shall rise the vast and spreading tree of Irish literature, suggesting that it is our duty to care for that seed and tend it until it has grown to perfection after its kind. In other words, Yeats is talking about the Irish people as if they were a plant, a seed that needs to be tended. So this allows us to refine our 12th thesis. Hopes and Fears relies upon organic metaphors because it is an essay about the cultivation of the Irish people. Thesis 13. Hopes and Fears is structured on a distinction between decadent art and an art of heroic conviction. Yeats uses the example of the French poet Paul Verlaine. Decadent art, he says, is predicated on the idea that poetry has nothing to do with thought, nothing to do with philosophy, nothing to do with life, nothing to do with anything but the music of cadence and beauty of phrase. This is the new doctrine of letters. By contrast, Yeats's hopes for Irish literature are that literature must be the expression of conviction and be the garment of noble emotion and not an end in itself, an opportunity for the display of great characters and great passions. And this allows us to refine our thesis 13. Hopes and Fears is structured on a distinction between decadent art and an art of heroic conviction because Yeats is trying to cultivate Irish people to national and artistic ends. Thesis 14. In Hopes and Fears, Yeats ratifies the dominant sense of the fin de siècle as an age of decline. The essay is structured on a distinction between French and English art and Irish art, and they have different problems. We have the limitations of dawn, he says. They have the limitations of sunset. The idea being that French decadent art, as English decadent art, are symptoms of decadent nations, whereas Ireland is just beginning. It is a seed. He suggests that it will grow into broad noon and pass on at last into twilight and darkness, like France and like England. But for now, it's a young, indeed unborn nation, full of hope, hence his hopes and fears for Ireland and Irish literature. This idea of the fin de siècle as an age of decline found potent expression in Max Nordau's book Degeneration from 1895, a 600-page monster of a book diagnosing the decline of Western civilization. It begins with an account of the dusk of nations. And Nordau uses Paul Verlaine as an example of how French art has declined into decadence. Yeats contrasts Verlaine and France to Ireland. Here in Ireland, he says, we are living in a young age full of hope and promise, a young age which has only just begun to make its literature. And so this allows us to refine Thesis 14. In Hopes and Fears, Yeats ratifies the dominant sense of the fin de siècle as an age of decline, but exempts Ireland from the diagnosis. Thesis 15. Hopes and Fears situates Irish art in a space beyond time. Yeats suggests that many Irish writers are writing too much too fast. And he suggests that he who would belong to things eternal must, for the most part, renounce his allotted place amid the things of time. And if you read the poems that accompany this lecture in our reading pack, The Stolen Child and The Hosting of the She, you'll see that these poems share a preoccupation with leaving the world of decay, decline, sadness and weeping. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. But again in Hosting of the She it's the same thing. The host is rushing twixt night and day, and where is their hope or deed as fair? Cuilta tossing his burning hair, and Niamh calling, away, come away. So we can refine Thesis 15. Hopes and Fears for Irish Literature situates Irish art in a space beyond time, thereby exempting it from the degenerative process. Thesis 16. Hopes and Fears wants to cultivate the Irish people by honing their interest in Irish folklore and mythology. Here again we can take the example of Hosting of the She. What Yeats knew of Irish folklore he learned from his collaborator on Cathleen ni Houlihan, Lady Gregory. And for him, Irish folklore and mythology was a source of Irish passion. His idea was, he says, if we can but take that history and those legends and turn them into dramas, poems and stories full of the living soul of the present, and make them massive with conviction and profound with reverie, we may deliver that new great utterance for which the world is waiting. We may make all these restless energies of ours alike the inspiration and the theme of a new and wonderful literature. So we can refine Thesis 16. Hopes and Fears wants to cultivate the Irish people by honing their interest in Irish folklore and mythology in order to reinvigorate the fin de siècle with an injection of Irish passion. Thesis 17. In Hopes and Fears, Yeats's project for a nationalist art reproduces the structure of nationalist time. His project for Irish mythology is taking material from the past, injecting it with the living soul of the present in order to make the literature of the future. And here we might recall from Lecture 2 Tom Nairn's claim that nationalism is the modern Janus. It looks forward and backwards at the same time from its position in the present. Ireland, embodied as a woman, looks to the past of her lofty passions in order to fill the living soul of her present to write the literature of the future. Thesis 18. In Cathleen ni Houlihan, Yeats reproduces the nationalist time of Hopes and Fears. Recall that Cathleen ni Houlihan was first performed in 1902, the present, but its scene is an interior of a cottage close to Killala in 1798, the past, and the entire impetus of the play is towards the bloody future of sacrifice. Many that are red-cheeked now will be pale-cheeked. In other words, Yeats's nationalist art, like his project, his Hopes and Fears for Irish Literature, and his play Cathleen ni Houlihan, and nationalism more generally, has a very specific kind of time. It articulates a present that is informed and legitimated by the past in order to justify actions that secure a nation in the future. Thesis 19. In Cathleen ni Houlihan, blood sacrifice and art both provide ways to defeat degeneration and the decline of nations. Think about the ending of Cathleen ni Houlihan, the chant of the poor old woman. They shall be remembered forever. They shall be alive forever. They shall be speaking forever. The people shall hear them forever. If we remember here too, Thesis 3, we suggested that Cathleen ni Houlihan is a play about dying for land rather than living to possess it. If anyone would give me help, he must give me himself. He must give me all. And we might refine this thesis further now to say that Cathleen Houlihan is a play about dying for land rather than living to possess it, but in dying the nation comes into possession of itself. We might recall here too Thesis 10, which says that Cathleen Houlihan is a political allegory in which Irish men turn away from mundane matters of social reproduction and the business of profit or respectability in order to regenerate their nation by marrying a strange woman called Death. And this might allow us to refine Thesis 19. In Cathleen Houlihan, blood, sacrifice and art provide ways to defeat degeneration and the decline of nations, but they do so by promoting a cult of death. And if you look to the ideology of Irish republicanism after Yeats, you'll see how potent this idea became in Irish politics. Here we can see the gravestone, a memorial in fact, to the site where Captain Noel Lemass was found dead during the Irish Civil War. He was abducted by Irish Free State troops and dumped on Featherbed Mountain. On the memorial you'll see that they say that Captain Noel Lemass died so that the Republic might live. And this is an example of this potent conflation of death and regeneration that Cathleen Houlihan articulates. It justifies Yeats's question later in his life, did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot? Perhaps it did and perhaps it didn't, but it certainly provided a potent artistic statement of the regenerative power of blood sacrifice. Which leaves us with Thesis 20. In Cathleen Houlihan, Yeats offers a formula for the reinvigoration of the Irish nation that likens blood sacrifice to art in its ability to defeat death. He who would belong to things eternal must for the most part renounce his allotted place amid the things of time. In Hopes and Fears, he's talking about the Irish writer. In The Stolen Child, he's talking about the Irish people. And in Cathleen Houlihan, he's talking about Michael Gillane as an embodiment of the young men of the Irish nation to come.